Sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one nobody notices. The announcement echoed across Terminal B at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport as thousands of travelers rolled suitcases across polished floors beneath bright ceiling lights. The smell of coffee drifted through the air. Departure boards flickered with changing gate numbers. Business travelers hurried toward connections. Families gathered around charging stations. In the middle of it all stood Danielle Carter, a quiet black woman in a navy cardigan, holding the hand of her 9-year-old daughter, Ava. To everyone around them, they looked completely ordinary. Just another mother and child trying to catch a flight. But appearances can be dangerously misleading. Ava adjusted the small backpack resting on her shoulders and leaned closer to Danielle. The little girl still looked pale from the surgery she had undergone months earlier. Her doctors had cleared her to travel, but only if she avoided unnecessary stress. Danielle smiled softly and squeezed her hand. "Just a little longer," she whispered. "Then we'll be there." Their flight to Washington, D.C. was scheduled to board in less than 30 minutes. Everything had gone smoothly until they reached the customer service counter. That was where Melissa Grant worked. Melissa was known throughout the terminal for running her section with absolute authority. She moved with the confidence of someone who believed every decision she made was beyond question. Her crisp uniform was immaculate. Her expression rarely changed. Travelers often lowered their voices when speaking to her. Some avoided eye contact altogether. As Danielle approached the counter and presented her boarding passes, Melissa barely glanced up. Her fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard. The clicking of the keys sounded unusually loud against the hum of the terminal. Then Melissa frowned. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Step aside," she said. Danielle blinked. "Excuse me?" Melissa tapped the screen again. "There's an issue." Danielle remained calm. "What kind of issue?" Melissa offered no explanation. Instead, she called another employee over and pointed at the monitor. Ava looked up at her mother, confused. Around them, travelers began slowing down. Curious eyes drifted toward the counter. Danielle waited patiently. She had spent most of her life solving problems by staying calm while everyone else panicked. Minutes passed. Finally, Melissa straightened and folded her arms. "You won't be boarding this flight today." Ava's face fell. Danielle's voice remained steady. "There must be some mistake." Melissa's expression hardened. "The decision has been made." A murmur spread through the growing crowd nearby. Danielle could feel dozens of eyes on her now. The giant windows overlooking the runway reflected the afternoon sunlight across the floor. Somewhere in the distance, a jet engine roared to life. Ava tightened her grip on Danielle's hand. "Mom," she whispered. Danielle looked down and smiled reassuringly despite the tension building around them. Then she turned back toward the counter. "I'd appreciate it if someone could explain exactly what's happening." For a brief moment, Melissa's jaw tightened. Something about Danielle's composure seemed to irritate her even more than an argument would have. The terminal suddenly felt quieter. Travelers stopped walking. A man near a coffee stand lowered his phone. A flight attendant paused mid-step. Nobody knew it yet, but within the next hour, this ordinary airport dispute would trigger a chain of events that would make national headlines and change the future of an entire airline. Danielle noticed the subtle shift in the room long before anyone else did. People were no longer walking past the counter. They were watching. A businessman in a charcoal suit paused beside a charging station. A young mother pushing a stroller slowed her pace. Even the gate agent across the terminal seemed distracted by whatever was unfolding. Melissa Grant appeared completely unfazed by the attention. She glanced at the line forming behind Danielle and released a slow breath through her nose. "Ma'am, I have already explained the situation." Danielle remained calm. "Actually, you have not explained anything." Melissa's fingers tapped the counter. "Your reservation has been flagged." "Flagged for what?" Danielle asked. "That information is not available to me." The answer made little sense. Danielle had heard hundreds of explanations in her life. This was not one of them. Beside her, Ava shifted uncomfortably. The child looked tired now. The bright lights of the terminal reflected in her eyes as she glanced toward the large windows facing the runway. A silver passenger jet slowly pushed back from its gate. "Mom," she whispered, "are we still going?" Danielle crouched slightly and offered a reassuring smile. "We are going to figure it out." Ava nodded, but the uncertainty remained on her face. Danielle stood again and carefully placed both boarding passes on the counter. "Could you please call someone who can explain the issue?" Melissa hesitated. For the first time, a trace of annoyance crossed her expression. She picked up a phone, spoke quietly into the receiver, then hung up. "A supervisor is on the way." The crowd continued to grow. Somewhere nearby, an espresso machine hissed. A rolling suitcase rattled across tile. Overhead speakers announced a departure to Dallas. Yet the space around the counter felt strangely isolated, as if an invisible circle had formed around the confrontation. 10 minutes later, a tall man wearing an airport operations badge approached. His name tag read Kevin Marshall. He looked from Melissa to Danielle and immediately sensed the tension. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked. Melissa answered before Danielle could speak. "Reservation issue. Passenger has been advised she cannot board." Kevin studied the screen. His forehead creased. Then he clicked through several windows. Once, twice, 3 times. The silence stretched. Danielle watched carefully. Kevin's confidence began to fade. His eyes narrowed. He leaned closer to the monitor. Then something unexpected happened. He looked genuinely confused. "That is strange," he muttered. Melissa folded her arms. "What?" Kevin did not answer immediately. Instead, he clicked again and stared at the information displayed on the screen. The color slowly drained from his face. "This cannot be right." Melissa straightened. "What are you talking about?" Kevin swallowed. "The reservation is valid." Danielle said nothing. Melissa blinked. "Then why was it flagged?" Kevin looked around before lowering his voice. "I do not know." The words landed heavily. Travelers exchanged glances. Phones appeared. Someone started recording. Ava looked up at her mother. Danielle remained composed, but inside, she felt a familiar instinct awaken. The same instinct that had guided her through years of investigations. Something about this situation was wrong. Very wrong. Kevin continued scrolling through internal records. Each passing second seemed to make him more uncomfortable. Then he suddenly stopped moving. His eyes locked onto a line of information hidden deep within the system. He stared at it for several moments before looking directly at Danielle. The expression on his face had changed completely. It was no longer confusion. It was recognition. Kevin looked at Danielle for several long seconds before glancing back at the screen. The noise of the terminal seemed to fade into the distance. Melissa noticed the change immediately. "What is it?" she asked. Kevin did not answer. Instead, he carefully turned the monitor slightly away from public view. His fingers hovered above the keyboard. "Sir," Melissa repeated. "What are you seeing?" Kevin swallowed. "I think we should move this conversation somewhere private." Danielle remained perfectly still. Ava stood quietly beside her, watching the adults with growing curiosity. Melissa let out a short laugh. "Private? For what? She is just a passenger." Kevin's eyes shifted toward Danielle again. Something about his expression had changed. Respect had replaced confusion. "No," he said softly. "I do not think she is." The words instantly pulled more attention from the surrounding crowd. Several travelers exchanged glances. A man holding a carry-on lowered his coffee cup. Someone near the gate began recording openly now. Melissa folded her arms tighter. "What exactly are you talking about?" Kevin leaned closer and lowered his voice. "Her profile contains a federal clearance designation." Melissa blinked. "A what?" "A federal clearance designation." For the first time since the situation began, genuine uncertainty appeared on Melissa's face. Danielle offered no reaction. She simply rested a hand on Ava's shoulder and waited. Kevin clicked through another screen. The glow from the monitor reflected across his glasses. "There are special handling instructions attached to this account." Melissa stared at him. Attached by who? Kevin's jaw tightened. That information is restricted. The terminal suddenly felt colder. Outside the massive windows, a passenger jet rolled slowly toward the runway. Sunlight flashed across its silver fuselage before disappearing behind another aircraft. Inside, the atmosphere around the counter continued to shift. People sensed something unusual was happening even if they did not understand what it was. Ava tugged lightly on Danielle's sleeve. "Mom?" she whispered. Danielle looked down. "Yes, sweetheart. Did we do something wrong?" Danielle smiled gently. "No. Sometimes people make mistakes. The important thing is how they fix them." Kevin heard her answer. The words seemed to affect him more than she realized. He returned his attention to the screen and continued reading. Then his eyes widened. "Oh no!" Melissa stepped closer. "What now?" Kevin rubbed his forehead. "The system shows multiple override attempts." "Override attempts?" "Someone manually blocked this reservation." The crowd murmured. Melissa's expression hardened. "That cannot be right." "It is right," Kevin replied. "The log is right here." He pointed at the screen. Timestamps filled the record. Several entries had been added during the previous 24 hours. Each one carried authorization codes. Each one pointed to deliberate interference. Danielle remained silent, but inside, her instincts were confirming what she already suspected. This was never a random mistake. Someone had wanted her flight interrupted. Someone had taken deliberate steps to make sure she did not board. Kevin continued scrolling. Then suddenly he froze again. His face turned pale. "What is it now?" Melissa demanded. Kevin slowly looked up. "The authorization code belongs to corporate headquarters." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Even Melissa looked stunned. Corporate headquarters almost never involved itself in individual passenger reservations. The possibility made no sense. Yet the evidence sat directly in front of them. Danielle stared through the terminal windows toward the runway, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. Somewhere deep inside, pieces of a much larger puzzle were beginning to fit together. And for the first time that afternoon, she realized this situation might not be about a flight at all. Danielle slowly turned away from the window and looked back at Kevin. The crowd surrounding the customer service area had grown even larger. Travelers who had originally been rushing to their gates now lingered nearby, pretending to check their phones while listening carefully. The overhead announcements continued. Boarding calls echoed through the terminal. Rolling suitcases rattled across polished tile. Yet the tension around the counter seemed to exist in a world of its own. Kevin stared at the monitor as though it might suddenly change its mind. It did not. The records remained exactly where they were. Melissa shook her head. "Corporate does not interfere with individual reservations." Kevin looked at her. "That is what I thought too." Ava stood quietly beside Danielle, her small hand wrapped around her mother's fingers. The child looked tired. The long day was beginning to show on her face. Danielle noticed immediately. She knelt beside her. "How are you feeling?" Ava managed a small smile. "I am okay." Danielle brushed a loose strand of hair from the girl's forehead. "Just a little longer." Ava nodded. Watching them, several people in the crowd exchanged glances. There was something about Danielle's calmness that felt unusual. Most travelers would have been frustrated by now. Some would have been angry. Others would have demanded answers. Danielle did none of those things. She simply observed. She listened. She waited. Kevin clicked into another screen. His eyes moved rapidly across columns of information. Then he stopped again. A deep crease formed between his eyebrows. "This makes even less sense." Melissa exhaled sharply. "What now?" Kevin pointed toward the monitor. "The authorization trail keeps going." Melissa leaned closer. "What does that mean?" "It means whoever blocked the reservation did not stop there." He scrolled downward. Additional notes were attached. Danielle's attention sharpened. "What kind of notes?" Kevin hesitated before answering. "Instructions to monitor your movements through the airport." The crowd fell silent. Even Melissa looked stunned. Monitor her movements? She repeated. Kevin nodded slowly. Every checkpoint, every gate transfer, every system interaction. Danielle felt a cold certainty settle inside her chest. This was no longer an inconvenience. It was deliberate. Somewhere above the terminal, sunlight poured through the massive glass walls. The reflection shimmered across the floor like water. Outside, aircraft lined up along the taxiway, waiting for departure clearance. Inside, the atmosphere continued to tighten. Melissa crossed her arms. There has to be an explanation. Kevin swallowed. There is more. His voice had become noticeably quieter. He clicked one final entry. Then he leaned back in his chair. The monitoring request originated 11 months ago. Danielle's expression remained neutral, but inside, every alarm bell began ringing. 11 months. The exact same timeline as another matter she had been quietly working on. A matter known only to a handful of people. Kevin looked directly at her. Ma'am, I do not know what is happening here, but this reservation was not flagged because of a travel issue. Danielle slowly nodded. I know. Melissa stared at both of them. You know? Danielle looked toward the runway once more. Her reflection stared back from the glass. I think someone finally realized I was getting close. The words hung in the air. No one fully understood what she meant. Not Kevin. Not Melissa. Not the travelers gathered nearby. But somewhere far above the terminal, inside corporate offices hundreds of miles away, a phone began ringing. And the person who answered it suddenly realized that Danielle Carter had arrived exactly where she was never supposed to be. Kevin could not stop staring at Danielle. The confidence he had shown earlier was gone now, replaced by the uneasy realization that he had stepped into something much larger than an airport reservation problem. Around them, the terminal continued moving. Families hurried toward gates. Flight crews crossed the concourse. Departure announcements echoed from overhead speakers. Yet the small circle surrounding the customer service counter felt frozen in time. Melissa looked from Kevin to Danielle and back again. Close to what? She asked. Danielle did not answer immediately. Instead, she glanced down at Ava. The little girl was leaning against her side now, exhausted from the long afternoon. Danielle gently squeezed her shoulder. Do you need some water? Ava nodded. Kevin immediately reached beneath the counter and handed over a sealed bottle. Here. Danielle thanked him and opened it for Ava. The simple gesture seemed to remind everyone watching that despite the growing tension, there was still a child standing in the middle of all of this. Melissa shifted uncomfortably. I think somebody needs to explain what is happening. Kevin looked at the monitor again. I agree. Before anyone could speak further, a sharp tone sounded from the desk phone beside him. The sudden ring caused several people nearby to turn their heads. Kevin hesitated before answering. Customer service operations. His expression changed instantly. Yes, sir. Melissa straightened. Kevin listened silently for several moments. Understood. Another pause. Yes, sir. She is standing right here. Danielle watched carefully. She could not hear the voice on the other end, but she could read Kevin's reaction. Whoever was calling held significant authority. Kevin finally lowered the receiver and slowly returned it to its cradle. That was regional operations. Melissa blinked. Regional operations called directly? Kevin nodded. They want everyone to stop touching the reservation. The crowd murmured again. Melissa looked confused. Why? Kevin swallowed. Because corporate headquarters has already dispatched a response team. The words sent a visible ripple through the gathering travelers. Corporate response teams did not appear for ordinary passenger complaints. Most people knew that. Even Melissa seemed shaken. A response team for one reservation? Kevin shook his head. Not for the reservation. He looked directly at Danielle. For her. Silence settled over the area. Somewhere outside, a jet engine roared as an aircraft accelerated down the runway. Sunlight flashed across the glass walls. Danielle remained calm, but inside she could feel years of careful work slowly converging on a single moment. 11 months earlier she had accepted a confidential assignment. The investigation had started with maintenance records, then safety audits, then employee reports. Piece by piece, a troubling pattern had emerged. Missing documentation, conflicting reports, questions nobody seemed willing to answer. Every time she got close to the truth, another door mysteriously closed. Another witness disappeared from the process. Another report went missing. And now, standing in the middle of a crowded airport terminal, she was beginning to understand why. Someone had known exactly who she was. Someone had known she was coming. And someone had tried to keep her from reaching Washington. Then her phone vibrated. Just once. Danielle looked down at the screen. A single message had appeared. There were only 3 words. The review is active. For the first time all afternoon, Danielle's eyes narrowed slightly. Far away, in offices scattered across multiple states, investigators were already opening files. And at that exact moment, people who believed their secrets were safe were beginning to realize they had run out of time. For the first time since arriving at the airport, Danielle allowed herself a moment of silence. She guided Ava toward a row of seats beside the towering glass windows overlooking the airfield. The little girl rested her head against her mother's shoulder as the late afternoon sun painted long golden reflections across the polished floor. Outside, aircraft moved slowly across the tarmac like giant shadows drifting through light. Inside, the terminal remained busy, but the noise felt distant now. Kevin stayed near the counter, speaking quietly with regional operations. Melissa stood several feet away, no longer projecting the certainty she had displayed earlier. Travelers continued watching from a respectful distance, sensing that something important was unfolding. Danielle looked down at the message on her phone again. The review is active. 3 simple words. 11 months of work hidden behind them. 11 months of late nights studying maintenance records. 11 months of interviews, audits, reports, and unexplained discrepancies. She remembered the first document that had caught her attention. A routine compliance report that should have matched federal safety records. It had not. At first, the inconsistency seemed minor. Then another appeared. And another. Soon the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every time investigators requested additional documentation, delays followed. Every time questions were asked, answers arrived incomplete. The deeper she looked, the more resistance she encountered. Yet she had never expected the resistance to become personal. Ava shifted slightly beside her. "Mom." Danielle brushed her daughter's hair gently. "Yes, sweetheart. Are we in trouble?" Danielle smiled softly. "No. Sometimes the truth takes a long time to catch up with people." Ava considered that answer for a moment before nodding. She seemed satisfied. Children often understood more than adults realized. Across the terminal, several airport employees had gathered near a service corridor. Their expressions carried the same mixture of confusion and concern. Rumors were spreading now. Phones buzzed. Messages traveled between departments. Supervisors began receiving unexpected calls. A few minutes later, Kevin approached carrying a tablet. He looked exhausted. "Ma'am," he said quietly. "Regional Operations wants to know if you are comfortable waiting here." Danielle glanced around the terminal. "I am fine." Kevin nodded. "They also asked me to inform you that federal representatives are already reviewing documents." Danielle was not surprised. Once certain procedures were activated, events moved quickly. Very quickly. A soft orange glow filled the terminal as the sun dipped lower outside. Reflections shimmered across the windows. For a brief moment everything felt strangely peaceful. Then Kevin's tablet chimed. He looked down. His eyes widened. He read the message twice before speaking. They just suspended access to several corporate systems. Melissa overheard him. Suspended. Kevin nodded slowly. Effective immediately. The color drained from her face. Danielle remained still, but inside she understood exactly what that meant. Investigators had found something significant, something important enough to trigger emergency safeguards. Somewhere beyond the airport, beyond the city, beyond the view of every traveler inside the terminal, doors were opening. Files were being examined. Questions were being asked. And people who had spent months hiding behind paperwork and authority were beginning to discover that the truth had finally arrived at their doorstep. The atmosphere inside the terminal changed just after sunset. The bright orange glow outside the windows faded into deep blue, and the runway lights began to sparkle across the distance like a field of stars. Travelers still moved through the concourse, but conversations had become quieter. News traveled fast inside airports, faster than most people realized. By now, dozens of employees knew that something extraordinary was happening. Danielle sat calmly beside Ava, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder. The little girl's steady breathing seemed almost untouched by the storm gathering around them. Kevin remained nearby, his tablet in hand. Every few minutes, another notification appeared. Every few minutes, his expression grew more serious. Finally, he approached Danielle again. "There is something you should probably know." Danielle looked up. "What is it?" Kevin hesitated. Federal investigators have completed the first stage of their review. Melissa stood several feet away and immediately turned toward them. The color had not fully returned to her face since hearing about the suspended systems. "And?" she asked nervously. Kevin glanced down at the tablet. They found evidence supporting multiple compliance violations. The words seemed to drain the remaining noise from the area around them. Melissa stared at him. "Multiple violations?" Kevin nodded slowly. "Maintenance reporting issues, audit discrepancies, documentation irregularities." Danielle closed her eyes briefly, not because she was surprised, because she finally knew the investigation had reached the same conclusions she had reached months ago. Around them, several airport employees exchanged worried looks. Some quietly stepped away to make phone calls. Others remained frozen in place. The terminal lights reflected across the polished floor as if nothing had changed. Yet everything had changed. Kevin's tablet chimed again. This time he read the message silently. Then he read it a second time. "What now?" Melissa asked. Kevin looked up. The review board just issued an emergency recommendation. Danielle immediately understood the significance. Emergency recommendations were rare. Extremely rare. They only happened when investigators believed ongoing operations could not continue without immediate examination. Melissa gripped the edge of the counter. "What does that mean?" Kevin swallowed. "It means this is bigger than anyone thought." Several feet away, a television mounted above a restaurant suddenly switched to a breaking news segment. Travelers began pointing toward the screen. The volume was low, but the headline was impossible to miss. Federal review expands into major airline compliance investigation. Kevin slowly turned toward the television. Melissa followed his gaze. The crowd gathered beneath the screen grew larger with every passing second. Danielle remained seated. Ava still slept peacefully against her shoulder. For a moment, Danielle watched the reflection of the television in the terminal windows. 11 months of work, hundreds of documents, countless hours spent chasing answers. And now the truth was no longer hidden inside reports. It was becoming public. Then her phone vibrated again. Another message appeared. This one was longer. She read it carefully. "The review board has voted unanimously. Immediate action authorized." Danielle stared at the words. Around the country, investigators were moving faster than anyone had anticipated. Somewhere inside corporate headquarters, executives were undoubtedly scrambling for explanations. But deep down, Danielle suspected the most important decision had already been made. And within the next few hours, an entire industry was about to witness consequences that could not be reversed. The terminal television switched fully into breaking news coverage just after 8 o'clock. What had started as whispers was now unfolding in front of millions of viewers across the country. Anchors spoke rapidly as new information arrived by the minute. Travelers gathered beneath the screens. Airport employees stopped pretending not to watch. Even passengers rushing toward late departures slowed down long enough to see what was happening. Danielle remained seated beside Ava, who had only recently awakened. The little girl rubbed her eyes and looked around at the crowd. "Why is everyone staring at the televisions?" she asked softly. Danielle smiled. Because sometimes the truth takes a while to arrive. Ava leaned against her shoulder again. Nearby, Kevin stared at his tablet in disbelief. Notifications were arriving faster than he could read them. Every few seconds another update appeared. Regional offices, federal investigators, compliance boards, emergency review teams. The situation was escalating far beyond anything he had witnessed during his career. Melissa stood motionless near the counter. The confidence that had once defined her posture had disappeared entirely. She watched the television screen as reporters described years of alleged reporting failures, internal inconsistencies, and unresolved safety concerns. None of this had been public knowledge that morning. Now it dominated every headline. Then Kevin received another message. He read it once, then again. His eyes widened. "It happened," he whispered. Melissa turned toward him immediately. "What happened?" Kevin looked up slowly. The review board issued its final emergency order. The crowd seemed to sense the importance of the moment. Conversations faded. Even the constant noise of the terminal felt quieter. Kevin swallowed. The airline's operating certificate has been suspended pending federal review. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The words seemed almost impossible to process. On the television above them, the same announcement appeared moments later as a red banner stretched across the screen. Travelers gasped. Employees exchanged stunned looks. Phones appeared everywhere as people called family members and coworkers. Melissa stared at the screen as though it belonged to another reality. "No," she whispered. "That cannot be happening." But it was. Across the country, flights were being halted. Corporate offices were entering crisis mode. Executives who had spent years dismissing concerns were suddenly facing questions they could no longer avoid. Danielle said nothing. She felt no triumph, no excitement, only relief. Relief that the process had worked. Relief that facts had finally been heard. Relief that future passengers might be safer because people had chosen integrity over convenience. Kevin approached her quietly. "I think I understand now." Danielle looked up. "Understand what?" Kevin glanced toward the television. "Why somebody wanted to stop you from getting to Washington." Danielle followed his gaze to the breaking news coverage. Outside the massive windows, runway lights stretched into the darkness like lines of gold. Inside, the truth had finally become impossible to ignore. And as the headlines continued spreading across the nation, one thing became clear. The investigation was over. But the consequences were only beginning. 3 months later, the airport looked exactly the same. Travelers hurried through security lines. Departure boards flickered overhead. Suitcases rolled across polished floors beneath bright lights. From a distance, nothing seemed different. Yet for Danielle Carter, everything had changed. She walked through the terminal holding Ava's hand as sunlight streamed through the giant windows overlooking the runway. The little girl looked healthier now. Stronger. The color had returned to her cheeks. Her smile came more easily. She no longer seemed weighed down by hospital visits and uncertainty. Danielle noticed it every day and never took it for granted. As they passed a coffee stand near the center concourse, Ava pointed toward a departing aircraft climbing into the blue afternoon sky. "That one is beautiful," she said. Danielle smiled. "It is." The child looked up at her. "Do you think people are safer now?" Danielle paused for a moment before answering. Outside, another aircraft began its takeoff roll, accelerating down the runway beneath the bright Georgia sun. "I think a lot of people worked very hard to make sure they are," she said. Ava seemed satisfied with that answer. They continued walking. Along the way, several airport employees recognized Danielle. Some nodded respectfully. Others offered quiet smiles. She returned each gesture with kindness. She carried no bitterness, no desire for revenge, only gratitude that the truth had finally reached the surface. The investigation that followed had become one of the largest compliance reviews in recent aviation history. New oversight procedures were introduced. Reporting systems were redesigned. Independent audits became mandatory in areas that had previously escaped scrutiny. News outlets spent weeks discussing the changes. Industry leaders debated reforms. Experts analyzed every detail. Yet none of those headlines mattered as much to Danielle as the simple fact that future passengers might travel more safely because someone had chosen to speak up when it would have been easier to stay silent. Near gate C-17, Danielle noticed a familiar face. Kevin Marshall was standing near a service desk reviewing flight schedules. When he saw her, he smiled immediately. "Good afternoon." "Good afternoon, Kevin." He glanced at Ava. "You look fantastic." Ava grinned proudly. "Thank you." Kevin laughed softly. "I wanted you both to know something. A lot of people around here still talk about that day." Danielle shook her head gently. "It was never about me." Kevin nodded. "I know. That is exactly why they remember it." For a moment, none of them spoke. Beyond the glass, sunlight reflected across the wings of a departing aircraft. The terminal hummed with the ordinary rhythm of travel. Life moving forward. Kevin eventually returned to work. Danielle and Ava continued toward their gate. As they walked, Ava slipped her small hand into her mother's. "Mom." "Yes. You were never afraid, were you?" Danielle looked down at her daughter and smiled. "Of course I was." Ava seemed surprised. "Then why did you keep going?" Danielle glanced toward the runway where another plane rose smoothly into the afternoon sky. "Because doing the right thing is not about being fearless," she said softly. "It is about moving forward even when you are afraid." Ava squeezed her hand. Together they stood quietly near the window, watching the aircraft disappear into the clouds. No celebration, no applause, no grand speech, just sunlight, a mother and daughter, and the peaceful silence that sometimes arrives when truth finally finds its way home.